Hello everyone, doing a video on this machine again, but as you can tell from the title, it's going to be on XP era games. Now, there is a GT1030 in here, which obviously can't be used on Windows XP. So the machine is running Windows 10. I have shown this machine before, as you can see in the video in the top right corner. This is my, for lack of a better term, daily driver. I use this for pretty much everything now. And the main reason for that is because it's a 75 watt machine. And during gaming it only really pulls 70 watts in total. And the other advantage, while you can see a fan there, and obviously there, this machine is completely silent. Because as I showed before, this only spins when it gets very hot. And that's only really when you're running some games, but even then it only runs about 800 RPM, maybe 1000, so you can't hear it. And of course the GT1030 is passive. It gets a bit warm. I mean, I've had this on for a bit, and I've had this on for a few hours, and you know, I can put my hand on it. It's warm to the touch, but it's okay. It's only been off for a few minutes. Storage, obviously SSDs. There's not much else going on here. 16 gig of RAM, as I mentioned before. And that's about it, really. Of course, for modern games, with the slow CPU, it's only a dual core after all, and the GT1030, it's going to struggle. You're not going to be running, well, you could run Fortnite on this machine, but it's not going to be an ideal experience. So, what I have been using this machine for the last couple of years is a retro gaming machine. Originally, it had a GTX 750 Ti in here, which is low profile, and 2 fans. It was quite loud, so I upgraded to a GT1030, which is technically a slower card, granted, but in my point of view it was an upgrade because of how silent it is. Now I do have an SSD in here that has Windows XP on it, which I occasionally switch in a GT710 or a GTX 750 Ti, depending on the game is, because some games just don't quite work in Windows 10. Most of them do, so 95% of the time it's in this configuration. It is an ivybridge machine using the Z77 chipset. The CPU is a i5 3470T, but it's worth pointing out it is only 2 cores and 4 threads, running at 2.9 GHz with a boost clock rate of 3.6. Now, of course, I could put the i7 in here, which has a clock speed of 2.5 and a boosted of 3.7, but because this has a higher clock speed at base, I find that it works better for retro games because they normally like a higher clock speed and they don't really use more than 2 cores anyway. So let's move on to what this machine can do in terms of retro gaming. Now I'll focus on XP era. Now what I define XP era games as 2001 to 2009. Now the reason why I go for the extra few years at the end is because I kind of ignore Vista entirely in terms of gaming, because it basically caused fragmentation in the market, and a lot of the games that were released between 2006 and 2009 were mainly aimed at XP. A few special ones were aimed at Vista as well, Halo 2 for example, but overall most games were still aimed at XP. It wasn't until Windows 7 came out that we kind of made the jump to NT6. So before anyone points out that game wasn't designed for XP, it kind of was, and I was in games development back during that period of time, and everything we built was for XP, with testing happening on Vista to make sure it ran. So yeah, that's kind of what it was. Yeah, all of these games will be running at 1080p. Let's get started. We'll start with the oldest, moving forward in time to the latest. So performance will decrease as we go, well it should anyway. First up we have Serious Sam, the second encounter. As you can see, it's running really well. Frame rates above 200 most of the time, with an average around about 230. So more than playable at 1080p, and all the settings maxed out. Next up we have GTA Vice City, also running at 1080p. As you can see here, very similar kind of thing. We are hitting above 200 quite often, with it hovering around the 150 mark, and throughout the course of this little run backwards and forwards, just at the opening of the game, we hit an average around about 190 FPS. So once again, very high frame rates. You can play it on a nice 200Hz monitor and you're good to go. Next, let's look at Half-Life 1. This is the source version of it, so from 2004. As you can see, we're hitting the engine cap at the 300 FPS mark, and we're averaging around 295, which isn't a surprise. Runs very smoothly, runs very well. No shocks here, because it is an old game made in a old engine. Old now, but it works really well.
You will find med kits like this one throughout the Black Mesa compound. To restore your health, walk up to a med kit and press your use key. Your health will recover gradually until you are at full health or the kit is depleted.
And by extension, of course, Half-Life 2 also runs very well. Not as good, of course. We're not bumping up against that 300 FPS limit, but we are hitting an average of around about the 160 mark, depending on what you're doing. So the frame rates are well above 100 most of the time. So once again, on a high frame rate monitor, you can get a very nice experience. Sticking with the FPS theme, here is Painkiller, the first version, and as you can see, similar to Half-Life and Half-Life 2, we're getting very high frame rates. This game has got no cap that I'm aware of, and we're hitting 300 FPS at times with an average of the high 200s. So once again, you can play it on a very high frame rate monitor and enjoy it. And once again, 1080p. So you could maybe fiddle around with some higher resolution settings, because this game can be bumped a bit further. Moving forward in time, here is another absolute classic, which is Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. Of course, all the other Splinter Cell games before this run just as well. Pandora's Tomorrow, you may need to make a few amends to the files to get it to run, but it does work. But as you can see, 100 FPS, no problem at all, with an average around about the 90s. So solid performance all round, very smooth gameplay.
I swear, please don't kill me!
Fine. If you don't know where the guns came from, then tell me something else that's useful.
Morgenholt! Morgenholt! You must be here for him!
Well, here's an example when I say that games from certain eras were designed for XP. I mean, this is Sam & Max, and as you can see, it's got a 4:3 aspect ratio, just because of the way it was built and how long ago it was made. Even though it was released at the end of the XP era, you may think that it's struggling to run. It's only hitting about 49-50 FPS, but that is because the Steam version of this game and the original version has a 50 FPS cap, and as you can see, it's running on DirectX 8, so a very old version of DirectX, but still fun to play. If you get the GOG version, there is an FPS cap of, I believe, 1000, And there is now also a remastered version of this, which you can download on Steam at the moment. Though the voices have been redone, and it's not quite the same game. But if you like some nicer visuals, certainly go pick that up.
In this room. Aha!
Oh, there it is!
Unfortunately, this is not Swiss cheese.
So what?
So, the rat was very specific about wanting Swiss cheese in particular.
Moving on to another absolute classic of a game. Here is Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. This is on the ultra settings, I believe, not the maximum. Can't remember what they called them in this game, but very high details anyway. And as you can see, we're getting very high frame rates. Depending on what you're doing, you're getting plus 100 FPS at times, with an average around about 132, with the odd dip below the 60. But that's just because of how this game works. But overall, very, very, very high frame rates on a GT1030. Once again, running at 1080p. Now here's a slightly obscure game, excuse the pun, Obscure 2. It is a kind of Resident Evil fixed camera style game with a slightly more modern feel, very controller orientated, so it's very hard to play with mouse and keyboard, as you can see here. But as you can see, it runs really well. We're getting above 60 FPS all the time, with an average around about 105. As you can see, it's kind of doing some strange things where it's in 4:3 and then 16:9, but that is just because this game for the PC wasn't very well made. Next up, we have Dawn of War 2. This is just the built-in benchmark. This is running on maximum settings. And as you can see, we're getting a decent frame rate. It does struggle when it gets very busy, but this isn't really a limitation of the card. This is more of a CPU problem. And even on very fast CPUs, you can struggle to get a solid 60 FPS in this game in particular. So on the highest settings, we get an average frame rate of 51 FPS throughout the benchmark. But if we run it on some slightly lower settings, which is high, we can get that up to 53 FPS. So you can probably fiddle with some settings here to try and optimize it a little bit, but it runs absolutely fine on the max settings during the campaign, which is slightly less intense because it's more mission based. Let's pop back to Bethesda, shall we? This is Fallout New Vegas. This game is an absolute stunner. If you haven't played this particular game, you should really pick it up. It's far better than Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. And as you can see here, we're doing pretty well. This is on high, so not the max settings. And we're averaging around about 76 FPS, depending on what's going on. When there's some shooting going on and you're getting hit and there's explosions, it can drop a bit. But overall, for most of the time, you're getting this nice, smooth, above 60 FPS experience on this very old CPU and this very low-end card.
What are you talking to me for? Talk to Krieger.
Here we have Battlefield Bad Company 2. Not quite as good as the first Bad Company, but still fun all the same. This is running on high, so not the max settings. And as you can see, it's dipping below the 60s in places, but it's more than playable. We're getting a good, solid FPS throughout. If you turn on VSync, you can get a slightly smoother experience. But this is right at the end of that XP era. This really is a Windows 7 game at this point. And as you can see, it runs just fine. Now, here we have The Witcher. Once again, this is right at the end of the XP era. This is running on the highest settings. And as you can see here, we're getting an average of 60 FPS with the GPU sitting around about the 50 to 60% mark. VSync is turned on because I forgot to turn it off. And it's a perfectly smooth playing experience, so it's more than enjoyable. Another game that had VSync turned on is World of Warcraft. Now, technically an XP game, but because it's been updated and it's currently still in development, not really an XP game anymore. And I don't think you can even run it on XP. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the case. As you can see here though, 60 FPS no problem. It is running on, I think, setting 5 or 6, so not the maxed out of course, but you can see that the GPU is sitting around about the 70% mark. So more than playable on this card, but we're now getting into the realms of not really XP games anymore.
Remain vigilant. You have my attention. I pray we chose our allies.
Now let's push it forward a little bit. Here is Tomb Raider. Technically this is more of a Windows 7, Windows 8 game, granted. But this just shows you what this card and this machine can still do. So you're not completely limited to retro games. Though I suppose this technically is a retro game at this point. But you can play some more intense 3D stuff from more modern era gaming. So you're not completely locked out if you have a machine like this. But I just wanted to go to show that there isn't any issues with running older games on these kind of cards. And you can run newer games, of course. Once again, VSync is turned on here, and the GPU isn't maxed out. I just like to keep VSync on a lot, and I forget to turn it off.
This could be a way through. Damn it.
Well, as you can see, a machine like this can easily run retro games. Not exactly a new machine. Ivybridge CPU, I mean Sandy Bridge would be fine. Most of the work and most of the heavy lifting is being done by the GT1030. Of course, if you want to do a real XP machine, a GT750 Ti is a better card than this, and basically a direct replacement. But of course you could always go with something like a GTX 960 if you really want to go overkill. But anyway, if you are interested in building something like this, or have a GT1030 lying around, it is worth pointing out that not all old games will run perfectly. As you saw by Obscure 2, there's some oddities going on. Some of them cannot be fixed because the games were bad in the first place, but other things can be fixed, and a great resource for this is PC Gaming Wiki. Link in the description if you're not aware of it. And here we have the page for Samamax Save the World, which is what the first season was called. If you want to call it seasons, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Episodic games. And as you can see, it states that it is only a 50 FPS cap, but GOG has a 1000 FPS cap. So if you get something weird going on, you can go on here and check. You can also see that resolutions can be changed. The default resolution is 4:3 aspect ratio. So if you don't like what you see, sometimes there's a fix. But if you pop there and the fix isn't present, then you're stuck with it. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, dislike, leave a comment. Any questions you wish to have answered, leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you could, please subscribe. That'd be amazing. I'm going to revisit this machine in the future with the GT710 and the GTX 750 Ti using XP to see how well it works. So anyway, thank you for watching and goodbye.